Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Noah Gordon, and I co-direct the Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where we explore how climate change is changing the world. We're here today to talk about the intersecting problems known as the Polycrisis. More on that term in a moment. First, I want to introduce the three great guests we have for you today. First, David Wallace-Wells. David is a writer for New York Times Opinion, a columnist for the New York Times Magazine, and writes a great weekly newsletter for the paper on climate change, technology, and the future of the planet. He's also the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. David, welcome.
Great to be here.
Second, we have Kate Mackenzie. Kate is co-editor of the aforementioned Polycrisis newsletter, blog, platform, everything, and an independent writer, researcher, and consultant who advises organizations pursuing the goals of the Paris Agreement. She's also a fellow at the Center for Policy Development, a nonpartisan Australian think tank. Kate, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Noah. Great to be here.
And finally, Tim Sahay. Tim is the co-editor of the Polycrisis at Phenomenal World and the co-director of the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. Tim, welcome.
Thanks.
So this event is co-hosted by the Carnegie Endowment and the Polycrisis. So I want to give Tim and Kate a minute to introduce their newsletter and platform. Tim?
Thanks. No, yeah, we launched the Polycrisis about a year and a half ago, and we really set out to examine these intersecting crises in our economy, in our commodities, and geopolitics and climate. So our aim was to have a unified, some sort of joined up thinking on the political economy of climate, and really to break some intellectual and political silos where, you have security people and climate people and commodities people all sort of not able to come up with a common language. So we just said, let's just have a pigeon where we sort of teach each other some elementary concepts from each of these areas. And since we've started, a year and a half ago, our sort of world crisis of ecology and economics and empire has just continued to metastasize. And it is really sort of shaking confidence in all of our established worldviews and in ruling elites everywhere. And so we are here to discuss that today with you.
Yeah, I can't recommend it highly enough. The same goes for David's work. So here's how today's event's going to work. Each of us has a polycrisis story, a story on a crisis where the whole is even more dangerous than the sum of its parts, as Adam Tooze has put it. Climate change plays an important role in each of our stories. We're going to discuss each polycrisis story for about 10 minutes before we take questions from you, the audience. You can use the YouTube chat to put your questions in, and please include your name and affiliation if you'd like to. Up first, we have Kate. Kate, over to you. Polycrisis story.
Thanks, Noah. Yeah, my story is starting off with Guyana. Everyone has probably heard that Guyana has a huge amount of crude oil below its ocean waters, about 11 billion barrels, and an Exxon-led consortium is pumping out more than 500,000 barrels a day already, and that is likely to rise quite considerably. A few months ago, a video of the country's president, Dr. Irfan Ali, criticizing a journalist for questioning the ethics of selling oil. This video went viral when the question was on the basis that it's a country that's also very exposed to sea level rise at 5 times the global average rate. It's true that sea level rise can be actually different rates in different parts of the globe. And this was a big sort of juxtaposition of what wealthy countries and developing countries are able to do or should be entitled to do in terms of exploiting and profiting from fossil fuel reserves when there's almost no carbon budget left, really, to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming. But Guyana is one of only a very few new big frontiers in oil production. So I'm just going to pivot away from the kind of the questions about who's entitled to exploit what reserves and look at the fact that demand for oil is probably peaking, possibly peaked already by some measures. It's very contested when it's going to happen, but we have some pretty impressive authorities saying that oil demand is going to peak in the next few years. And the International Energy Agency says that it's going to peak before the end of this decade. Interestingly, just last month, the IEA put out another report projecting that the oversupply of oil, that the world will be producing too much oil by the end of this decade, to the tune of about 8 million barrels a day, and that global demand will fall from, will be only 105 million barrels a day by 2030, but there'll be another 8 million or so a day being produced. This is really unprecedented for the IEA to make this kind of warning. Typically, their role has been to warn of undersupply and underinvestment in future supply, but we're kind of changing into this new world, or moving into this new world where demand is total demand for oil is plateauing, and is not too far away from declining. So oil producers are very critical of that projection. But if you look at the countries that export oil and also the companies that produce oil, most of them are not acting like consumption is actually going to keep growing for decades, which is what most of them are saying will happen. Instead, they're planning for a future with shrinking oil demand. And I wanted to mention Saudi Arabia as a perfect illustration of this. Big and also commercial oil companies, big oil majors are returning more cash to shareholders than they are investing in future production, which is, again, a very unusual situation, especially when prices have been so high as they have in the last couple of years since the invasion of Ukraine. Saudi Arabia, being a country rather than a company, they of course have a national oil company, but they have a sort of a different obligation and a different sense of a different imperative, and are trying, are really keen to keep oil prices as high as they can for as long as possible, in the face of declining demand, which is mostly due to electric vehicles, also including 2- and 3-wheelers, efficiency of ICE cars, and so forth. We don't really know what this geopolitical and economic dynamic is going to look like, because we've only really lived in a world with increasing oil demand, and as the demand starts to decline, these countries and entities that are really dependent on oil, countries in particular, are going to face very different and interesting challenges, and in some cases quite difficult. For some, it's fine. For some, they can afford to invest in other industries, which is what the wealthier petrostates are doing, like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, very furiously. So I'll leave it there, so we can discuss this a bit more. But
there's so many different places to go with that. Now, Kate, it's a really good point. I mean, talking about peak oil demand, it really would be a revolutionary moment, because we haven't hit peak demand for biomass or coal yet. I mean, we just keep consuming more and more, as you guys have written about that on Polycrisis with your hockey sticks of doom and hope that Tim will talk about. I wonder if you could say more about how Saudi Arabia is responding to this. I mean, I guess in some ways they're pivoting to things that might not be so good for the climate, like petrochemicals, but also Saudi wants to invest more in energy transition in the global south and even become a mining powerhouse itself. So if you're concerned about emissions, how do we think about how Saudi is reacting to the possibility of peak oil demand?
Yeah, I think it's I think its reaction is not really that kind of hopeful in some ways, but I do take it as a sign that, despite the rhetoric that is coming from the likes of Exxon and Saudi Aramco and OPEC officials, actually the peak of demand is within sight, and it is being borne out by the behaviours of these entities, as opposed to their words. So yeah, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco's entities, which we can really effectively think of as the same thing, are doing things, as you mentioned, diversifying into all kinds of things. They've been diversifying furiously since the 2030 vision was announced in 2016, I think, in particular, trying to create a tourism industry domestically, health tech industries, and so forth. And also, as you mentioned, like investing in mining ventures, mining ventures, what else? Petrochemicals, downstream. They were investing in downstream processing. They own one of the biggest refineries in the US. A lot of it is economic diversification, but there is also, you can see this sort of hedging. So Aramco is an investor in a next generation solar wafer manufacturing technology firm, for example. Quite a bit.
I mean, I just want to pick up on one of the kind of the geopolitical bits that Kate and I wrote about last year, which is that, the West is essentially finding it very hard to fund any energy transition in the global South, right? So you have these COP meetings that are, the last COP meeting was in an oil kingdom. The Emiratis hosted it. The next one is going to be in Azerbaijan. So there's this big question of what are oil kingdoms and national oil companies going to be doing about the energy transition? And they're sitting flush on a lot of cash, as Kate mentioned. And what the West is sort of really saying to them is, look, like, we cannot get any money from our congresses as right-wing rising in the US, as right-wing rising in Europe. And so why don't we just outsource this energy transition business to you guys? You can fund the developing countries in Africa and Asia and invest in your version of the energy transition, because money for you is flush and easy, whereas money for us is hard and tight. And that's a very explicit geopolitical sort of development where the United States government is really working with the Saudis and Emiratis to fund developing countries. They created a new developing country fund at the last COP for expressly this purpose.
Yeah, and I think so I think that's right. I don't think the important thing, though, with these amounts of money, as is also the case with Western sort of climate money or traditional kind of climate money, international climate finance, is to look at where is the money going, where is it likely, or where is it likely to go, and on what are the terms. So the UAE fund that was announced at COP in December last year, for example. It's actually a profit-seeking fund, essentially. So it's going to buy shares in companies and green companies, and it's not like a concessional. It's not grants. It's not concessional loans even. Maybe there will be some equity. Maybe there'll be some generous equity terms, but yeah. These things are not necessarily kind of fixing the climate finance gap as we understand it, which is that a lot of the global South just doesn't have enough upfront accessible capital to implement the green transition, not to mention adaptation.
Kate, I did want to ask you, the reason we care about oil consumption, one reason is extreme temperatures. And we should always bring the focus back to climate impacts. Can you recount for our audience what happened at the Hajj, some of what the consequences of extreme heat were in Saudi Arabia this year?
Yeah, I think, we were all really struck by this story where reportedly over more than 1,300 people died from the intense heat of during a pilgrimage to a couple of weeks ago. And yeah, some of the scenes that were reported were just, really kind of really dire and upsetting. People being turned away from health facilities and so forth, tents to, and just dying from this like intense heat of, I think it got up to 50 degrees. And the thing is, Saudi Arabia has been aware of this heat for years, and they've taken measures, making water available and tents and so forth available, and for pilgrims. But at this, I think it's an illustration of this. There are like limits to adaptation, and those limits are usually going to affect the more vulnerable people. It wasn't the people that are coming early and staying in luxury hotels and so forth. It was it was people who presumably didn't have access to those facilities, and the facilities that were provided just weren't adequate in those extreme conditions. And we know that this is not something that is going to get better in future years.
It's really horrifying. And in our work, we talk so often about the second and third order consequences of climate change. But, as Jeff Goodell has written, the heat will kill you first. And we do. The heat alone can be devastating. But on that cheerful note, we're going to move to the next polycrisis story. David, what do you have for us? What's your story?
I'm going to talk about the social cost of carbon, which may not sound like a polycrisis problem since it's such a technical question, but it actually connects to a few things that we've already been talking about, which is to say, the obligations that the Western world may have but not actually pay towards people elsewhere, and exactly how to think about and tabulate the cost of impacts like the horrible heat that we saw at the Hajj. And, in that sense, I want to use this figure, the social cost of carbon, which has limitations and, the questions about its applicability and relevance and, but I want to use it as a sort of form of moral math that economists and bureaucrats like to play with, and which tells us something about the scale of the problem we're dealing with. And the reason that I think it connects to the broader question of the polycrisis is that in that sense, it amounts to an attempted solution to the problem of the polycrisis, which is to say, we're going to put one number on this whole mass of problems that are connected, and then we're going to proceed from that number to some set of approaches or responses. And, that's quixotic in many ways, but I think it's also useful just as a sort of stage setter for what we'll be talking about throughout this conversation. And so this is a figure, the crude way of putting it is it's an estimate for how bad it is to put an extra ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's been argued about and estimated in different ways over the decades at this point. And last year, the Biden EPA came out with its formal revision of its own estimate, which was $190 a ton in 2019 dollars. And that was, I think, about a 20-fold increase on Trump's estimate and about a 4-fold increase on the Obama era estimate from the EPA. But these are, government bureaucrats. They're certainly climate minded and climate economists working elsewhere. But they are also, working for the Biden administration. They're not simply climate bedwetters or alarmists. And $190 a ton in 2019 dollars, translated into 2022 dollars, is about $220 a ton, which means we are now officially estimating, the U.S. government is now officially estimating that the U.S. economy is doing something on the order of $1 trillion of damage a year based on its carbon emissions alone. And because most people who study climate change would tell you that to this point, the US is still on net benefiting from warming as opposed to suffering from it, that calculus implies that we are actually exporting something on the order of $1 trillion of damage a year abroad. And that is just an astonishing figure. It is, it's a number so large that people yell at you for bringing it up. This often happens when you talk about any sort of cerebral effort to calculate climate damages. The numbers get so large that they seem objectionable on a number of fronts, and people talk about estimates of damages as problematic because they're politically impractical. This is John Kerry's famous line, if you come to American voters with our climate debt, we're going to shout you down and scream at you and never let you talk about it again because they think that you're going to be advocating for reparations, which they're not going to stomach. People talk about it as politically ineffective in the sense of, suggesting that the damages are so large that we can do nothing about them. And they also suggest that they suggest a scale of damage that seems intuitively implausible. How could it be that, in the world that I know today that seems relatively normal, the U.S. is imposing something like $1 trillion of damage every year on the world. And that, I think, is the thing I want to focus on here, because, again, it circles us back to the question of the polycrisis, in that we have a sort of a resistance to seeing clearly, or in moral terms, the damage that we are doing. We prefer to not calculate those numbers, or to not take them seriously. And what that brings us to is a place where collectively we see the world as it is, as a zero cost setup with no damages being imposed. And what that means is that we have already learned to normalize an absolutely gobsmacking, astonishing, and terrifying level of climate damage. What that tells us about what the world is going to look like going forward, I think, is quite disconcerting. I think it suggests that no matter how large climate impacts become, we are likely to interpret them through other lenses, through other languages, sometimes talking in climate terms, but more often talking about other aspects of the polycrisis that they connect to. And while that may be useful and practical from a political point of view, I think it really deprives us of some of the moral clarity and wisdom of perspective that we would get if we were able to see the full scope of changes that we are imposing on the world today. And instead, we sort of move forward somewhat blindly, grasping forward, unable to see the full picture, and calling ourselves wise and practical for being that blind.
David, I've talked to a lot of people about the social cost of carbon, modelers and so forth, for example, who are involved in kind of developing and interrogating these numbers. And I think those comments that you made are so great, that a number just feels too reductive, and it's technically really not realistic in a way to be able to put this. To be able to put a cost on it, as I can't remember, one researcher said, the marginal cost of a ton of carbon is infinite, or so in terms of what we know of it, at least anyway. But something that I often hear as a defense of this practice is, it's a policy ready. It gives you a policy ready tool. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that, being, as the US being an interesting example of a place that's, had the social cost of carbon really present in some in some administrations, in the current one, and after not being there really at all.
Yeah, I think probably all three of the rest of you are better experts to talk about the details, the wonky details of the social cost of carbon and what it means. What I would emphasize, I think, on that point is that even as a policy-ready tool, it now seems too large to really implement into policy. What does that mean? It's like if we think about actually pricing this properly, it would completely transform the whole shape of the entire U.S. and indeed the global economy. And maybe that's worth pursuing. I'd like to emphasize here just what it tells us about the scope of the transformation that we're living through, more than about the practical implications for policy. But I also think that there's a big question about what happens when you have a policy-ready tool that develops into an impossible to implement estimate. And I think that's sort of where we find ourselves today. One simple response to the Biden estimate in particular would be to say, well, that number is so large because it is a global figure. And perhaps if it were simply domestic, as the Trump administration made it, it would be easier to implement. On the other hand, that would deprive that estimate of an awful lot of its moral meaning. And I think that would be damaging too.
David, I'd never heard the social cost of carbon discussed in those terms before. Like, this framing you have the U.S. exporting $1 trillion of damage is really interesting and shocking. And I think one reason it's hard to talk about is because we struggle to but when you put a number on the cost of carbon, you're getting closer to putting in like a value on the cost of a human life. And we do that in some areas of government and don't like to talk about it. Like, should a public health system pay for this surgery, or is it worth doing this and that regulation? And it's And then like with climate change, there's always a question of like intergenerational justice in this long problem. Like what discount rate do we use, and how much should we value the lives of people 100 years from now, and deciding whether to restrict emissions from a smokestack today. So I don't have a question. I'm just sort of processing the $1 trillion figure that you put out.
It's amazing how many people who I've spoken to about this, who are people who really work on this material, like I will do the math for them and say, okay, so your figure is this. Let me multiply it by the number of gigatons that we're producing. Here's the cost. And they're like, oh yeah, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. But maybe others on the panel have other thoughts.
Tim, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just curious about the air pollution component of that. I mean, you've written a lot about the air pollution, sort of just, 10 million deaths a year just from air pollution alone. And I do not remember the social cost of carbons, like the largest chunk of it. Is it just air pollution?
No, I don't believe it includes mortality at all.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask David about air pollution too. Like we're talking about global and even like intergenerational, but just on a local level, like I've been so horrified following the story of New York's congestion charge and how it was blocked at the last minute, and how like this is about more than just money. Like this has costs in terms of time and air pollution and safety. So I guess maybe a quick question, David, do you think the congestion charge, is that a Polycrisis story as well?
Well, it's certainly a showcase of political dysfunction and the cowardice of political leaders, even in incredibly in places that you'd imagine would be quite supportive of climate action. I've been really distressed too, for climate reasons, but also just as a New Yorker, like I really want my streets to be less trafficked. I live at the intersection of a highway and a bridge that doubles as a highway. So I basically I would like less cars there, putting fumes into the lungs of me and my children. And I really think that the distressing lesson for me about that failure is that we've heard a lot in the post-IRA period about all of the obstacles to, particularly like the rollout of renewables and other climate action in the form of, regulatory oversight, legal action, legal challenges, NIMBYism, NEPA problems. On some level, since the passage of the IRA, that has been like the dominant area of discussion among climate wonks. And this was a case where we had gotten through all of those hoops and over all of those obstacles, and yet the political cowardice of a single figure was enough to torpedo this quite significant program. And I think, that's not to downplay the other challenges. It's not to say that we're primarily dealing with a political problem when we talk about, the problem of political leadership when we talk about climate action in the U.S. But it is to say that, it can sometimes be easy in the confines of, a little conference room or, a social media chat to say, to point the finger at permitting reform or whatever. And the truth is, if we are rebuilding all of the American energy system and transportation system and industrial system and agriculture and industry, all of that stuff at once, we are going to be operating through an entire cobweb of challenges that are not reducible to a single target and include a lot of personal human difficulties like we saw in New York with Governor Hochul.
Yeah, and when the obstacles to the energy transition are more personal and political, it's even more frustrating. Like when the obstacle is physical, like batteries are less energy dense than fossil fuels. Like, okay, that's going to be a challenge. We can work with that. But then here you run into a governor who is very worried about a few congressional races in New York and made the questionable decision to put off the charge. Okay, I'm going to tell my Polycrisis story now, shifting south from New York to another metropolis in the Western Hemisphere, Mexico City. So the data point for my Polycrisis story is 0. That's the amount of water that some reports said would come out of taps in Mexico City after June 26, which they call 0 day. As it turned out, there was more than 0 water available because of efforts to reduce consumption, and some rain came. So this isn't an extinction level event where people die of thirst in massive numbers, but to paraphrase the climate scientist Kate Marvel, humans should probably aim for better than not extinct. That's a pretty low bar for us. And there are a few reasons why I think the ongoing water crisis in Mexico City is a Polycrisis story. First, climate change is at the heart of it. I mean, we have higher temperatures in Mexico, set some temperature records there due to climate crisis. So you have more evaporation of groundwater. There's also a drought there, which scientists say is linked to climate change, as well as the El Nino weather pattern. So we can blame climate change in part for the near dryness of the Cusmatala aqueduct system, which supplies the capital with about a quarter of its water. But, like any polycrisis, it's intersecting problems. And it's also just like a supply-demand problem. You have 20 million people there. And in so many cities, they've been paving over roads and pumping water from aquifers for years. And households, industries, farmers, will come back to them, all want to consume more water because it takes a lot of resources to live, to give 8 billion people a good life on this planet. So you have this, the biggest culprit is probably just poor infrastructure. Mexico's water operator says about 40% of the city's water is lost due to leaky pipes. And then, climate change exacerbates economic problems. It leads to those repairs not being done. Second, it's also a story about inequality in politics. When she was on the campaign trail, Mexico's now president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who's a climate scientist, said every water user needs to put the national and people's interests above individual interests. But that's usually not how people respond. Lots of neighborhoods are facing water rationing or just get dirty water to use for household chores, and you have street protests about the water shortages. And some, in some parts of the city, armed guards have to accompany the water tanks to make sure they're not stolen. You have wealthy Mexicans who have basically lakes of drinkable water. And then you also have some water siphoned off illegally to maintain avocado orchards, and then the fruits are exported to richer places. So there's these sort of north-south questions, the virtual water trade that does come up here about what is the water being used for. It's agriculture is the biggest user. And then finally, and I think of Tim and Kate's work here especially, like you see the connection to the politics of finance and currency. Juan Pablo Spinetto at Bloomberg has noted the contrast between the Mexican government cutting the budget for the Water Commission, which would repair these pipes, as it increases state funding for Pemex, the debt-ridden national oil company. According to some estimates, Mexico could fix the water system for less than 10% of what it spends on Pemex. But Mexico has to think of how can it earn dollars from selling the crude oil that powers the world economy. You get into really hard trade-offs here. Polycrises are not easy to solve. And then finally, there's Mexico-U.S. relations. I mean, Texas politicians like John Cornyn, the senator, are angry that Mexico isn't providing the water to Texas that it is required to under a 1944 treaty. So it's just an issue where you have all these things coming together to cause a crisis that climate change is making worse. So I've been trying to learn and read more about it over the past weeks. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on water crises in Mexico or elsewhere.
I wonder, you mentioned very briefly that, just as an aside, like whether, what portion of the water use is agriculture. And I wonder how that looks in Mexico City, because in the US, whenever we hear about water problems, it is like always talked about in terms of, green lawns and shower lengths. And it's like, I don't know, it's something like 90% of water use in the American West goes to agriculture. But we talk so much less about that as a problem. How does it shake out, and how does it break down in the context of Mexico City? Do you know?
I don't have the figures with me for that, but it's almost always agriculture, basically everywhere you go, and especially animal agriculture. Industry tends to use a lot of it, but it's so silly when we focus on like celebrity swimming pools or things like that. And as you were saying, like in the American West, you did have something like it was 80 plus or 90% of water being used for agriculture. And you even have people like being unable to build new subdivisions, or can we set up this chip foundry here while we don't talk about wasteful use of water, like growing cotton or alfalfa in the desert. And I mean, I have read about the avocados coming up as an issue. That was in the news recently with some U.S. avocado inspectors being, attacked by some Mexican criminals when they were trying to do inspections. But there have been some subsistence farmers in Mexico who have been destroying the illegal irrigation systems that water these avocados because they're shipped for export and there's no water left for local people. So you keep coming back to agriculture, which in general is not something we talk about sufficiently as a cause and also victim of the climate crises.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a similar-ish kind of story to some degree in Australia here. We haven't had really widespread droughts for a while now, but, there's a massive millennial drought between a lot of the time that I wasn't living in the country, so around in the 2000s. And for the first time, public opinion did, or, the public gaze, I guess, shifted to the fact that we've got these rather large cotton and rice growing industries, which are incredibly water intensive, not animal agriculture so much. But meanwhile, droughts are not uncommon here, and there had been numerous campaigns. Everyone's pretty familiar with 4-minute shower campaigns and not being able to water, only watering your lawn on certain days. And it was really quite a moment here, I think, around like 2004, when it was first, the whole question of industry suddenly came into view, of the agriculture industry came into view. And it's been interesting to see how it's really been pushed back on. They're not unpowerful industries, even though there's an argument that maybe they're not that suited to a country that's got very little potable water.
There've been some video of like water riots in Delhi too, right, over the last month or two.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to you guys earlier about the water minister in Delhi going on hunger strike because the situation is so bad. And this problem was made worse because of the outrageous temperatures we had in Delhi in June, when 52 Celsius, 125 Fahrenheit, just shocking temperatures. And so it's we I started to focus on Mexico City, but we could have talked about like the Cape Town in 2018 or Chennai in 2019. There are a lot of places, or even if you just talk about groundwater depletion, like in Jakarta, where the city is sinking. It's not a climate change story. It's just a sort of, I don't know, overconsumption story of using so much water that the capital is sinking, and Indonesia is building a brand new one on a different island.
Yeah, is there a similar problem in Mexico of just sort of like plenty? You get a lot of floods and you get a lot of droughts. I mean, what we don't talk about enough in the climate story is the water cycle is now extremely volatile, right? So unless countries are investing in storage systems and sort of slow it down, sink it down, sort of urban greening systems to recharge those groundwater tables, and stripping away a lot of the concrete and hard surfaces in cities that is the reason why we get so much flooding in cities. I don't see a solution that is just exclusively focused on agriculture. Obviously, agriculture is the biggest user, but it seems to me that we've had 100 years of urban planning that has just completely upset the water cycle by caking everything in hard surfaces. And we should be thinking about urban redesign. I worked on this problem in Boston for a couple of years. And it's a very tough nut to crack because real estate interests don't want you to just like give up expensive urban land to green ribbons and to rain gardens, and they fight it quite vigorously.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tim. There are sort of ironies of the climate crisis. I mean, places that suffering drought get too much water and can't handle it or can't capture it, or the air pollution that David was talking about earlier, like our efforts to cut air pollution in some cases raise temperatures because we're not blocking as much of the incoming sunlight. So you do have these strange stories where we have too much and too little at the same time and end up in trouble.
And also a lot of fuel to climate denialists. So like, can't you guys get your story straight? Is it a joke?
What's going on here?
But I think to that point, I think it's really useful to just always keep in mind that, like global totals or even local annual totals for anything like rainfall are often quite misleading, and understate the degree of transformation and disruption that we're living through, because you can have months without rain and then you have a crazy, like Delhi just had, and then crazy days of flooding, and some mathematical way that balances out, but the experience on the ground is very much not in balance.
Yeah, it's a challenge with modeling to predict exactly what, or to get confidence around how rainfall is going to change. But something that does seem to be, fairly reliable is that intensifying downpours, and just generally becoming more erratic. So it's sort of long been a difficult kind of question about climate impacts, I think.
We're getting lots of great questions in the chat already, so keep them coming. But I want to turn to Tim for our last Polycrisis story before we start hearing from the audience.
A hopeful one, right?
This is going to be a hopeful one, and it's going to be about the hockey sticks of hope that we've been calling, which is, the immense acceleration in solar production coming out of China and large across the world. So the number that I have in mind is 11 cents per per watt, which is the cost of solar modules now. And that was around 30 cents per watt just 3 years ago. So it's almost fallen in a third in price in just the last 3 years. And it's coming out of that immense sort of technological dominance of China, which has been sort of, it's not really a subsidy story. It really is a process of technological learning and squeezing of costs with process efficiencies. And that's an industrial policy that China has pursued since, the late 2000s, early 2010s. Of extreme competition between a lot of private firms, a lot of very large private firms that are now going down that cost curve. And we are hitting it around 11 cents per watt. And they've generated a lot of sort of process patterns. And this is really a story of sort of technological learning. And we've been sort of digging into one of our Polycrisis themes is, what are the geopolitics of this? What are the economic questions that arise from these solar hockey sticks of hope? And, there's some positive ones, there's some dark side ones. So I thought just share some of those with you. So the positive one is, what does it actually mean now that solar is literally a dirt cheap commodity? Jenny Chase, who's the solar analyst at Bloomberg, had this fantastic example of Europeans are now starting to use solar panels as fencing for their gardens because it's cheaper than the wire mesh fencing that you might buy. So that's a completely, who the hell would have thought you'd do fencing with solar panels? Then there's the immense positive implications of what happens when countries are facing very disruptive electricity crises. So think about Lebanon, think about South Africa in the last couple of years. And what they're doing is importing these solar panels, very sudden switches in countries' policies where they start to import those solar panels. And it's not really the country deciding that. It's a lot of private actors, people, firms, businesses that are just sick and tired of the electricity being out and start to import solar panels as a form of sort of self-generation, resilient self-production. And then you get very fast reductions in air pollution if those solar panels are cutting into coal or if they're cutting into gas, which is, the next sort of big story is solar plus batteries cutting into coal and cutting into gas. So you're going to get a lot of sort of air pollution reductions, a lot of reductions in these electricity crises. So those are some of the positive implications. And there are dark sides to this hockey stick of hope, and that's human rights abuses in Xinjiang, where a lot of the polysilicon, which is the initial component of solar panel manufacturing, is manufactured in Xinjiang. And that has led to a lot of human rights campaigners and a lot of energy and climate people sort of saying we should make sure that these solar panels are not coming from polysilicon made from Xinjiang. And then the sort of the geoeconomic questions are, should the West be de-risking from China? Should we not be getting these cheap solar panels? Should we be creating our own industrial policy to create new solar panel manufacturing capacity at home, whether it's in the US or whether it's in Europe? And that has caused, as you may have heard in the news recently, we just put a 50% tariff on solar panels. Those tariffs will start in 2024. Is that going to slow down climate action in the United States because we don't have enough solar panel domestic manufacturing capacity quite yet? So these are some of these sort of geoeconomic trade-offs. And the last element of that is what we've been calling this sort of cat and mouse game, where Chinese firms realize that, well, they're going to be slapped with a solar tariff if it says made in China. So instead, it's now made in Southeast Asia. So it's coming from Laos, it's coming from Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, and this is something that started over a decade ago. So it's going to be very hard to really enforce any kind of tariff policy.
And yeah, how do you see that playing out? Because it's not just, I think in the U.S. we've heard a lot about the U.S.-China kind of bilateral trade war, but it's obviously more complicated and global than that. How do you see the next few years unfolding with the global exchange of solar panels?
I think you're going to get essentially countries realizing that they can use this cheap electricity and import the solar panels. And once you have installed those solar panels in your home territory, like, it can't really be weaponized against you. They can't be blocked against you, because once you have energy, those solar panels installed, they're going to continue to produce electricity. And I think what you're going to get is, few countries are going to reject those cheap Chinese solar panels, but most countries in the world are just going to take them up, and they're going to try and figure out what to do with it. They're going to try and figure out what, once you have cheap electricity, like you could use it. Noah was just telling us about the water problem. You could do it for desalinization. You could figure out making liquids. You could think about making other molecules out of, using electrolyzers to produce green hydrogen, for example. So I think you're going to get a lot of value added things that countries can do with that cheap electricity. And this is, in many ways, a technological revolution that is cheap electricity entering into more and more parts of the economy. So I'm not very confident of telling you exactly what that's going to look like, but pretty confident in telling you that.
You think the revolution is going to overwhelm any efforts to throw up barriers to it, basically?
Yeah, I think so. But as always, politics gets in the way, and politics is hugely important. And it's a fight between different types of political interests. So you have companies that make their money from installing solar panels, quite like having cheaper solar panels, whereas companies that are interested in manufacturing solar panels, would like to oppose them. So it's a fight between installation and climate advocates versus manufacturing and jobs and unions. And that's a domestic fight that will only accelerate as these panels get cheaper and cheaper.
Something, Tim, that you and I have talked about a lot with the rise and this massive increase in output and quality of clean tech from China is that China is now, from long being an importer of technology, China is now really an exporter of technology, of IP and not just IP and patent in the sense of patents, but also know-how and how to manufacture things really efficiently. And a question, I guess, that we've discussed, but I am always interested to hear your thoughts on it, is what can you see happening in terms of China now exporting that technology to other countries? I mean, particularly global South countries that are very keen to, move up the value chain or move along the value add chain rather than simply being called upon to export, raw materials or very, low value add labor to actually, it's really significant for development. The development potential pathway for a lot of countries to be able to make more sophisticated tech domestically. Is that, are we seeing, do you feel confident that we're going to see China facilitating that production elsewhere in the world, particularly in global South countries, or does that kind of run counter to China's own economic strategy at the moment, which is very much export led, investment led? They're really sort of doubling down on some aspects of their economic strategy.
I think this whole question of technological transfer, there's a way in which it works, which is just FDI. A Chinese company will set up a joint venture in Germany, will set it up with Ford in Michigan, will set it up to manufacture electric buses in California. So BYD has a bus manufacturing facility in California. So all of these are just classic FDI. It's sort of like a classic globalization story. And I think that is what we are seeing. A lot of countries just want to invite Chinese firms that are the leading firms in a particular sector, whether it's manufacturing solar panels, whether it's manufacturing batteries, and a host of other green tech sectors. And they invite Chinese firms to do these partnerships with their local firms, so that then their local firms can learn and upgrade their skills from a lead manufacturer. And this is basically the story of globalization for the last 50 years, right? developing countries have routinely invited leading American firms, European firms, German firms, Japanese firms to set up shop in their country, learn from them, and upgrade. That's exactly what you said. China did that for the last 40 years extremely successfully. And I think we happen to be in a position of sort of catch-up growth with China, which is what is a strange position for the Americans and the Europeans to be in. But you do see a bunch of European countries, Germany, Hungary, France, etc., inviting leading Chinese firms for that FDI. And I think you're going to see pretty much that same story play out in Brazil, India, Indonesia, and many other developing countries.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And even that there will be FDI into the US. I mean, the point of you should want to encourage tariff jumping and technology transfer. It's the only way the tariffs make sense. Tim, I want to pick up on, you mentioned that the small downside to this very positive story of the falling price of solar panels. It's hard to think that low prices for a necessary good could ever be a bad thing, but you do sometimes see that with other important clean energy inputs like lithium, because we've seen rapid falls in the price of lithium in 2019 after China cut subsidies, or in 2023 when a wild price spike ended. And they're mostly really, really good because it makes it cheaper to produce batteries and EVs today. But they can also bankrupt companies and destroy the business case for opening new mines today, which could mean we won't have sufficient lithium 5 to 10 years from now. And that's why you have growing interest among policymakers in ideas like a strategic minerals reserve or a strategic minerals bank that could backstop demand for important clean energy inputs. So, but yeah, I shouldn't spoil what was a very happy story at the end of a talk on Polycrisis. I want to go now to audience questions because we have another 10 minutes. We've got some really good questions in the chat. Kate, there's one that I think would be good for you about, here it is. Does the effective impossibility of integrating a real social cost of carbon on a global scale indict the financialization of climate in general? Basically, is there an alternative to the financialization of climate is the question.
Yeah, I think, as someone who's kind of arguably participated in the financialization of climate to some degree, I think it's a really good question, and possibly, possibly the answer is yes. Like in an attempt to make it to make climate something that we can measure in a financial, measure through a financial lens. We've made it, as David was saying really, really eloquently before, we've made it something that is both too big to contemplate if that is done robustly, but also kind of less, much less than what it really means. Like, is it really appropriate to be talking about a shift like this huge and extremely, threatening, damaging change to the stable climate that we live in terms of this economy and financial system that we've built in our society, this very abstract layer that we've built in our society. I don't know if it's really possible to reconcile those things. And then the other argument is like politically, in terms of, political effectiveness, has that been like the most effective way to actually get people supportive of taking action in climate on when everyone's got such, near to, most people are dealing with extremely short-term concerns in their life, and it's to some extent like financialization, talking about it just in financial abstract terms keeps it further away, makes it and makes it kind of seem more of an elite issue, whereas it's, as we know, it's really not.
I think there's as you guys have written about beautifully and brilliantly, there's also, if you're narrowly thinking about like how it is that developing countries can be supported in their efforts to decarbonize, there are, solutions to the problems there that do not incorporate a global reckoning with the, the social cost of carbon and the total damage estimate. It's just like, we see the problem of poor countries having cost of capital that is several multiples what it is in the rich world. That's a huge part of the cost of deploying renewables. How can we build a system that allows those prices and that gap to close? So I think, I think Kate is absolutely right that there's just some basic inconsistency and some problems about financializing this whole challenge. But I also think that there are sometimes narrower ways of thinking about what lies ahead of us that we can see relatively clearly in pretty conventional financial terms.
Yeah, I should add, I completely agree. And actually, some of the most difficult problems in advancing climate action globally are actually really simple ones that are constructs of our current system. If US Congress could ever, see its way to just, pretty kind of small changes, and certain other actors, courts in US and London, it's not that big a change that would be needed. As I agree, David, that could make a really significant difference to global solidarity and global ambition in terms of reducing the cost of capital, making it more available for lots of countries to invest in green things.
We have a few questions here about the framing of the polycrisis. I mean, there's one: what utility does a polycrisis frame offer to policymakers? Another one asking, could everything be considered a polycrisis? And then there's even another one on like what sort of governance do you need to address, is best suited to address the polycrisis? Tim, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Like, how can we take this frame that you use from your blog? Like, how is that useful for policymakers to think in this way?
I mean, one is just that if you have a web of interconnected crises, you need to create a more resilient system that can cope with unexpected new shocks. And, I'm very taken by something that Zoltan Poza, who was formerly of Credit Suisse, sort of wrote in what are policymakers sort of doing? And broadly, they're doing sort of the 4 Res that he put it. They are reshoring production. They're restocking. They're creating a whole bunch of commodity stocks like the lithium stockpiling that you wrote about, or the strategic petroleum reserve. So there's a lot of restocking. There's a lot of reshoring. There's a lot of rewiring. This is the solar hockey stick of hope sort of a bit, where there's a lot of cheaper renewables and you need to build up new grids and change your electricity system. So there's a lot of money being put for rewiring. And then there's the 4th Re, which is this rearming. There's a lot of war in the world. In fact, there's been a return of war to greater degrees than at any time since the end of World War II. So countries in a very highly securitized environment are spending way more money on war than they are spending on any of the other Res. So that has been the response of policymakers. Whether they're doing more spending on war and less on, what percentage in each of those 4 Res differs. So in the United States, we've had, since Biden's first year in office to this last year, the defense budget has gone up from about $600 billion to $900 billion. So that's an increase of $300 billion. While the rewiring program, the big Bidenomics and Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera, is, on the order of about $80 billion a year. So we're spending 3 or 4 times more increase in war than we have on green spending. So that gives you a sense of how policymakers are reacting to this polycrisis. And I don't think we should be sort of throwing up our hands and, we have no idea what to do. I think policymakers have decided what to do. It doesn't exactly look pretty.
I would just say, in response to the original question too, as a writer, as opposed to a policy person here, like for me, on some level, the implications, the utility of policymakers is a secondary consideration to the first job of describing the world as it's unfolding in front of us. We need to do that well if we hope to shift that system. For a first step is just seeing it as clearly as we can, which is, for me, the reason that polycrisis is such a useful framework.
I'll close. There's a sort of depressing question in the chat, but I want to close on it. Someone is asking, could you discuss the implications of the climate crisis on the political stability of countries? Will we be seeing a trend to authoritarian states? There are a lot of factors that determine whether a state is authoritarian or democratic or otherwise. Certainly some elements of the polycrisis and the climate crisis could push polities towards authoritarianism. If there's more pressure on resources, more demand for sort of rationing or walls or keeping people away from resources, fighting among groups to hold on to what they have. But you can also see the sort of the flip side of climate crisis as the opportunity that we have here. Some of the things, like we talk about with the solar hockey stick of hope, if we really did get power that was too cheap to meter, as people said of nuclear 50 years ago, like that's just transformative for the way people live and how we deal with disease and water shortages and so much more. And Tim, you were talking about people replacing unreliable diesel generators or bad grids with their own solar power. You could imagine if we solve the climate crisis in the way we promised to, that people are more secure and we turn away from authoritarianism and towards a more hopeful future, when sort of a future, there's a possibility of sort of abundance with lower emissions. So I wouldn't, just wanted to close on the note that there is still an opportunity here, even if the trends are quite bad. But with that, we're right at 5 o'clock. So I want to thank the audience for coming. And of course, thank all of our guests, Kate, Tim, David, for taking the time to be with us today. So goodbye from Polycrisis and the Carnegie Endowment, and we'll see you next time.